All right, it's Brett here again. We've just had a light rain, which I'm very cool with because daffodils are up and peach and cherry trees are already blooming, so this is good. It'll keep that going for us. Something nice to look at and smell here out on the front porch. My dog and my dog Jocko and my name Big Boy are both crashed out. It's a dog's life for both of them. But anyways, what I want to talk about today here is how I sometimes find it fascinating to walk around old graveyards. And I've lived all over the country. I remember when I lived in Massachusetts, I went up to Salem. And that's a really old part of the country. And there are gravestones up there that you could not possibly guess what it says on the front of them. Just gone. The lichen is eaten off the letters and stuff. And now I'm living, down here in Eden, North Carolina, which is also a very, very old part of the country. Just all kinds of old world artifacts and ruins and foundations and really old buildings and industrial architecture all over the place here. When you go to an old town or an old city, you very often find old graveyards there. Some of them are kept up nice, some of them aren't. And you can learn a lot about the town you live in by walking around a graveyard and looking at the names on the stones, and also looking at some of the what kind of stones are present there. And when my father's folks, my grandparents, died, they were buried in Cohocton, New York, which is in the Finger Lakes area. I thought it was very cool when I was a kid. My grandma died first. That the stone that they had was shaped like a heart. I know it seems kind of trite, with our last name being Hart, but it was the only one in the graveyard, and it was of a sort of a reddish brick-colored marble that you could see from a distance. It just really stood out, and I always thought that was quite cool. So anyways, I've always been interested in exploring abandoned buildings and structures since I was a kid. It's a wonder I'm alive today, the number of floors I could have fallen through. This goes back to the 1960s when we lived in Syracuse, New York, and I was able to take a look at stuff that had probably been sitting there for several hundred years, that seemed like it had been transported directly from somewhere in the Mediterranean. I mean, the same kind of buildings. We had buildings in that city in Syracuse that, looked like the kind of things that you see in Switzerland or in Budapest. A lot of the old world was still standing in the 1960s. Urban renewal hadn't wiped it out. And so I grew up around a lot of that stuff, and it was really fascinating. All my life, everywhere I've ever lived, I've been someone that'll go off and explore. When I was living in Korea, I used to run when I was younger, and I would run on the trails that would run all through the rice paddies over there. It was just a great place to run, no traffic. And they have these raised trails that crisscross the rice paddies. And one time I was out, probably about a half mile out in the middle of this swamp, as it were, and all of a sudden I spotted an island, out in the middle of the rice paddy, an elevated bit of land there, maybe about a 20th of an acre, perhaps. And I ran in that direction, and I went there and started scoping around, and there was a mound, like half of a globe, a mound of earth that probably stood 8-10 feet high and might have had a 20-foot diameter, right smack dab in the middle of this island, which had tall pine trees on it. And in the center opening in the grove was this burial mound, and there was a stone in the ground in front of it that had stuff written in it in old Korean, real old Korean. Too old for me to read. I went back out there and revisited it on several occasions, and it was fascinating. One time there was a dead deer that had been left there, on purpose, it seemed to me. But anyways, here in Eden, it's a very old town, particularly this part of it called Leaksville, and the adjacent part called Spray, which was once called Splashy. I think that a historian, an honest historian, could just have an amazing time coming here and taking a look at what there is and contrasting it with the mainstream narrative about what they're seeing. Because I've found that we can go back and take a look at population records and compare them with narratives about certain buildings and schools and, municipal buildings and so forth going up, and how many years, if it took longer than a year to put them up. You don't have to be a terrifically brilliant person to realize that in a county that only maybe has 20,000 people in it, men, women, children, and old folks, there's absolutely no way that a textile mill that covers several acres of land and is made of brick and steel and everything was built in a couple of years by the able-bodied workers from that 20,000 people, especially when there were other industries going up at the same time, according to the mainstream narrative, in other places around the county, other mills, textile and tobacco factories and so forth. There was not a population here that could possibly have made the buildings that are here at the time when they say they were made. And this is very fascinating stuff. So when you walk into a graveyard and you start walking around and seeing people that lived until about 1830, and you start looking at names, you begin to see, from which families your community sprang. I get into all kinds of thinking when I walk around, a burial ground of any sort. Always try to be very respectful and not, stroll across the dead. Generally, there are paths that you can take if you keep your eyes peeled. Gosh, this just made me remember something else. I remember one time I was going through the drive-thru here in town of a place to grab a cheeseburger. And after I pulled out, I hadn't left the parking lot yet, and some fella started beeping his horn at me. And I stopped, and I asked him, I said, "Are you okay?" And he was looking at the back of my truck, which had some stuff written on it and painted on it. And he asked me if I could paint signs. And I said, "Of course I can paint signs. What do you need?" And he told me that his brother had died and that he wanted to make some kind of a sign that could go where his brother was buried, at a graveyard, I think, out in Reedsville. And so I asked him to write down on a piece of paper his telephone number and his name and the text that he would like on the sign. And we discussed the size he would like and what I might make it out of. He settled on wanting me to make a cross in the final analysis and put the text on it. And I told him, "Okay, I'll go ahead and do that, and I'll get in touch with you when it's finished." And so, I leaned on in and got it done in a couple of days and got in touch with him. He told me which cemetery to go to, and we had a time that we were going to meet there. We did, and I brought it, and he was very happy with, this memorial, and I helped him get it in the ground there. I don't know. It felt like an appointment, to meet this person. And he was a lovely guy. I've never seen him since. I remember he mailed me a thank you in the mail, and I hung on to that. It was sweet. But anyways, why do I walk around graveyards? I walk around graveyards because they're fascinating to me. They are almost like a book of where you live. And here in Eden, some of the graveyards actually seem to be built on top of the foundations of something that was there before there was a graveyard there. You see rectangular and square boundaries that look quite a bit like rooms. Uh-oh, cars pulled in the driveway. Time to stop again.